No, I'm just kidding. I think, are we live? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we?
Hello, everyone. Now I can
Hello.
pull it up so I can see the chat. Hello. It's good to see Lindsay is on time.
Hello, Taylor.
Hi, Taylor. Why is it not showing up for me to get?
I've been struggling recently with YouTube trying to find lives. Like for some reason they're not showing up. Like on their channel. I have to like look for it on the YouTube search. It's really weird.
Yeah, you can't like go on someone's channel and have like their live pop up, which is weird.
I've been having that same issue, and because this is like especially on my own channel, like I couldn't even get it to pull up the chat till just now because I had to wait for it to go live. So
on the Google Hangouts, you used to be able to like change it so it would show up on your channel up to 2 weeks before, but now I can't figure out how to do that with a new YouTube Studio thing.
Yeah, they're trying out a bunch of new stuff. So
anyway, hello everybody.
Yeah, hello everyone.
Hello.
Hi Swirls. Hi Crumkim. Hi Victoria.
We're here to discuss deep scenes.
So yes, today we're going to be talking about writing deep scenes. Liselle made a very ominous comment that she probably would have some disagreements on stuff. So I'm very interested because I didn't feel like there were a lot of things to disagree with. I didn't feel like it was very opinionated.
It's more like an overall feeling.
Oh, okay. So then maybe I do know where you're going with that. Okay. Hi, Allie. Hi, Moon. So I know that like sometimes people in the chat watch this to see if it's worth getting. So not everyone has already read it. But I feel like I just kind of want to talk a little generally about what it is and what they're talking about before we get into specifics. And I just have like some questions and stuff. And of course, whatever you guys want to talk about. But I mean, writing deep scenes is literally just talking about how to write at the scene level. And it really kind of focuses on the three things, which is action, emotion, and theme. And that kind of actually brings me to like a question I already have for you guys, because when she gets into those sections, well, I shouldn't say she, because I don't know the gender identity of Jordan Rosenfeld. I don't know if anyone else does, but they for both of them. I always just want to kind of give credit to Martha. And that's not nice because it's not fun when you're the second name on a co-written thing. So Martha and Jordan, they break up the sections where you go through like the four, like because they break up the book into 4 sections, like a book that you write, and then they go through all 4 sections of action. Then go back to the beginning, all 4 sections in emotion. Then go back to the beginning and all 4 sections on theme. And I'm wondering what you guys thought of just that, of the way that the book is structured.
Hated it.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, same. I don't really understand the choice behind splitting it, because I feel like I was constantly having to switch my mind back to like each section. I had to switch my mind back to like, okay, this is the first part. It would have just worked better for me. Some people this might work better, but for me, it would have worked better altogether.
Yeah, the organization was really my like big beef with the book, is that I wished that it had been organized differently, because the organization was like so very difficult for me to follow.
Yes, I'm glad that I wasn't the only one who noticed that. I was like, am I being nitpicky that this organization does not work for me? Like, I just did not like, it didn't feel necessary, first of all. It also made it come off a little repetitive, because some of the things that you're talking about with action and like emotion, you could talk about them together. Like you're saying some of the same things for both. So I just felt like if you had a chapter on the beginning, a chapter on the middle, and then you could have subsections, right? The action of the beginning, the emotion of the beginning, the theme of the beginning.
I agree.
That would have worked so much better for me, because I do plan to use some of this stuff in my revisions next month, because I did find some stuff helpful in here. But it's going to make it really a pain for me when I want to look at stuff for the section I want to fix, which is in my the first half of the second act, you know, like the, what does she call it? The like beginning middle.
Middle?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to look at 3 different sections in the book for those things, rather than just having it all in one chapter.
She has the emerging middle and the deeper middle.
Which I did like those separations. And actually that was really helpful for me. And we can get back into that in a little bit. But the way it's organized is going to be such a pain for me to like apply some of this because I'm going to be doing so much switching around. And it made it come off repetitive. Even though I don't think all of it, I think she definitely, or they talk about very distinct things in regards to like action versus emotion, but it made it come off repetitive because we were going back to this same section and saying stuff again.
I just want to say what Moon said. It was very repetitive in general. At one point, it even said, "Don't worry, we'll be repeating this a lot." And I thought, I'm not worried. Stop repeating.
Yeah. And I actually like what Charlie is saying because this is exactly what I'm going to do. Charlie says, that is why I make workbooks for myself out of books I find helpful. That is literally what I'm going to be doing next month. I'm going to be revising my book based on Save the Cat, Story Genius, and this. And I'm going to kind of like make my own little like outline workbooky thing, taking the stuff from each of those that I'm hoping I can then apply to all of my books moving forward, having this sort of like pulling the things from each of those sections. Yeah. Because there were things, I mean, I'll admit that my feelings about this book are lukewarm. Like, I felt like there were definite things in here that I benefited from and definite things in here that felt very obvious and have already been said. And even the things that I felt like were helpful were not necessarily new. It was just the way in which they presented it hit me different than I've heard it elsewhere. And so I did like that. I did like, and I guess I can kind of segue into another organization aspect, which is the 15 different scene types.
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think about the 15 different scene types? Like that sort of breaking down those sections.
I struggled with it because I was like, okay, that's cool that you're breaking down the scene types, but I think I wanted more of a formulaic approach to how to inject those scenes. And I think a lot of it is like, you can do this scene, or you can do this scene, or you can do this one too. And I was kind of like, how to know which one? And I think I just wanted something that was like, bang, bang, bang. This is how you were using these. And without that, it was a little bit like, cool.
Yeah, I think this is like sort of similar to how I felt actually, because I did like that in those sections where they're talking about like, oh, the beginning section, the first quarter, you can use this type of scene or this type of a scene or this type of scene in those. I did find that slightly helpful, but you're right that there's no like application. I mean, okay, because that's a whole other point. Because all the examples that they use, there were just so many.
So many. And they were all so long.
They were so many. And I think if they would have just picked like 3 that they just continued on over and over again, rather than like 25 and then like 8 of them they kept coming back to, I think would have been more helpful. And also in terms of the scene types, I felt like a lot of them were like obvious, if that makes sense. And only some of them were like, oh.
That's what I was going to say is like,
yeah.
That's what I'm saying. It's like, overall, I liked the book. I didn't love it, but I did like it.
Right.
I think, though, that with the scene types, like you said, I think that if you just are a writer or even a reader, you naturally know that some of these already exist.
Yes.
So it felt like not new. So like some of them I was like, oh, yeah, like, okay. But then some of them I was like, yeah, this is just something that you know if you read or write, that like these are natural scenes. Like, so.
It felt like naming things that you already knew, you just didn't have the name for it.
I think part of that, though, might be on me, because I went into this thinking this was going to be a higher up writing book rather than like a 101. And it kind of, like, it wasn't really, to me at least, like, because I already knew a lot of this stuff. To me, it felt like another 101. So, like, maybe if you're just now going into writing, this could be really helpful for you, because it does talk about writing deep scenes, but...
Here, I would say I did think it was like, if we're thinking about like college, in terms of levels, I definitely thought it was going to be like a 300 level, but I wouldn't say it was a 100, just because the entire book is just on talking about the scene level.
Yeah.
And usually a 101 book would be something like Story Genius or Save the Cat, where it goes through the entire all aspects of writing a book. And because this is so in-depth, specifically about scene writing, that I would call it more of a 200 level.
Okay, I can see that.
Because even though it's not a lot of new information, it's making you stop and think very specifically for long periods of time about just on the scene level what you're doing, if that makes sense. Yeah. So it's a little bit closer in scope, I feel like, than a 100 level.
Yeah, I get that. I just expect, I don't know, I guess I expected it to be higher up.
Yeah.
I don't know why. That was just that. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I think my thing with it, it's just like if you've read Save the Cat or Story Genius before, I feel like it made it difficult to learn new things from this book because it was a lot of similar information. And I get, like, to me, that's why it felt like more of like a 101 book, but it was just because I had read Story Genius and Save the Cat before. I think if I had never read those books, then it would be like more in depth, and then I would like read like one of those books after, and like stuff would click together really well. But because I felt like they like Story Genius and Save the Cat like ruined me.
No, I think that's 100% like exactly how I felt about it. And how I would describe this is I do feel like this is a good companion to Save the Cat and Story Genius, because it does go a little bit more in some areas, a little bit more specific. And that's why I said what I plan to do next month is to take some elements of this. I'm kind of going to map out, like I'm going to use Save the Cat for like the book structure, and then Story Genius to help with like getting ready to apply a lot of the things and like what to do specifically. But then there's like some specific stuff on just a scene level that I plan to use from this. So I feel like it further enhances what Save the Cat and Story Genius, like it just gives you a little bit more like to think about, because I did think out of all three of the sections, if we're talking about action, emotion, and theme, I think theme was the most beneficial and with the most like new information. And I wouldn't call it new, right? But it spends a lot more time on that than I would say other books do. And so that is what I mostly felt like I will be thinking a lot more, just because I think sometimes, and this, I can only speak for myself, but I know that I feel like sometimes, because as I'm a YA writer, which all three of us are, we tend to think that, or I can't speak for you, but from my experience, that we think less about like literary techniques, in terms of theme, symbolism, things like that, because it's like genre, and we often think of these things being attached to high like literary, but I think that these things are important in all books that you're writing. And one of the things she even said, or they even say, is that theme is going to come out of your book whether you mean it to or not. So you might as well be meaningful and purposeful with it so that you control the narrative, so that you control what people are getting out of it.
I did like that.
I really like that.
Yeah, because I feel like people are always going to try and find something out of it. So I like that.
Human nature to connect dots, to pull things from stuff, make meaning out of things. So why not have a little bit more control so that people don't get the wrong meaning or the wrong impression, or that they don't get confusing or conflicting ideas from what you're reading, because that can subconsciously create like a reason why someone may not connect as much with the book or like it, and they might not know that's why. It's just because there's something like muddled there, because there isn't a clear sort of theme or what to sort of get out of the book. So I did think that was helpful. But I also think, so thinking about Save the Cat in particular, because I feel like this very much aligns with the Save the Cat structure. And want to think about it in terms of Save the Cat, right? So you have like, it's very much talking about the 3-act structure, and that the 2 middle parts are up to the midpoint turn, and then from the midpoint turn to the, the end of the 2nd act. What worked for me, the one thing that I feel like this, and it probably just hit me different, and it may have even been said in Save the Cat, and it wasn't something I picked up on in that book. But when I was reading about the action of the beginning, middle, or whatever, the murky middle, whatever. The first part
emerging middle and the
mostly the fun and games section, right? Mostly the fun and games up to the midpoint turn. Reading this, when she said that, so she calls them, what is it, energetic markers, which I could like that terminology to think about these sort of energetic moments throughout. But when she said that second energetic marker, which would be in Save the Cat terms, the midpoint term, should be a rededication to the goal, that's when I realized that my midpoint turn is wrong. Like, reading how she was explaining, or how they were explaining what should be happening at that second energetic marker, made me realize 100% what is wrong with my second act.
She texted me and was like, I know how to fix my book. And she's like, like somebody dancing.
Because it made me realize that my midpoint turn actually happens, what should be the midpoint turn actually happens in the middle of the fun and games. And what I had as my midpoint turn should actually be later, like in the Dark Night of the Soul section. And so I have to completely like shift everything over. And so that section was extremely helpful for me. And I don't know, does Save the Cat refer to the midpoint turn as a rededication to the goal? And I just missed that?
I'm trying to remember what I put it down as, because I can't remember if that's something I just naturally end up doing. But I just know that something like happens at the midpoint that like shifts things for the character. So like they'll have like, I think it's like they have the false win, or they have the
false victory or false defeat. Yes.
And so that kind of like, to me, is like I guess I would call that their version of like the midpoint turn, but they don't say anything about rededication as far as I remember.
So that's what I was thinking. I think it was just that using that terminology of rededicating to the goal was what made me realize I wasn't doing it right. Because I remember in Save the Cat, they said the midpoint turn are typically like parties or dances or whatever. I'm like, well, I have a party going on. That's happening. And something big happens where they think it's like, where it turns things in a dramatic direction. I'm like, well, that definitely happens at my party. This must be the midpoint turn, like based on that information. But then when I was reading, this, and she's talking, and they're talking about like what happens at that second energetic marker, I was like, well, this party is not right. That's not what happens here. This affects my main character so differently than what's supposed to be happening. And I realized that it's happening way too early. Way, way too early. And so it is going to take me basically rewriting the whole thing. I actually feel really good about it because it wasn't working, which is why I have been dragging my feet on my revisions and not being able to write, because I knew something wasn't right. Like the cadence wasn't there, or their momentum wasn't there. Like something was missing and I couldn't put a finger on it. And I don't know, just reading that section, I was like, oh my God, that's it. And then I like started writing like a whole bunch of stuff of like notes to myself of like how I could fix things. And it was like literally like a light bulb moment. So for that reason alone, this will always be a good book to me, because there was just something about like, describing that midpoint turn in that way that made me realize that I was getting it all wrong. I wasn't doing it right. So
we did have a question in chat really quick.
Sure.
Priya said, is the theme thing something to pay attention to in the first draft or later drafts?
So that's a good question, because they argue later. And I wanted to ask you guys, when you're writing, and you guys in the chat as well, what do you guys do in terms of theme? Do you think about that before you write your first draft? Do you go back and try to do that later? Or do you just really not think about it at all, and now you realize maybe you should be?
I think I usually do it I end up doing it at the end. Like, this is the thing. And this is why in this book, like that theme section, I really, really liked. And I thought that was really gold, because so often books are just like, and write your theme. And they don't tell you why you should have a theme or why it matters, especially like, when you're writing genre fiction, you're like, I just want to write something fun. And you're not necessarily thinking, oh, I have to teach something to the children. Like, you just kind of want to do your own thing. Yeah. But naturally, like in the last like couple books I've done, like I've put out the themes first, and I do that based on whatever character motivation I've put out, because I do my like character internal struggle sheet, whatever. I do that very first. So then based on like what my character's fatal flaw is and what they need to get out of the book versus what they want, that'll usually dictate my theme. So like in my debut, like she needs to trust her own decisions and trust that her decisions have weight and importance. And so the theme ended up being like believing in yourself and believing in your own abilities and skills and that sort of thing. And then like when I go through and I actually draft it, because sometimes I do whatever I feel like when I draft and I need to fix it later. And it's at that point where I like reevaluate and I'm like, have I actually stuck to the theme or is it actually something else at this point? But yeah, I like what they said about like looking at it after you've written your book.
Yeah, 100%. But before I say that, Kevin, what about you? How do you?
I was just going to say that I typically don't even really think about it in the first draft, which could be a flaw. I don't know. I mean, they seem to
they say not to.
They say, I like to just write and then see what like kind of themes naturally come up, or like what kind of themes I was maybe going for subconsciously. Because there are ones that, whether or not you mean to, I feel like every time you write a story, some kind of theme is there. Like, so for instance, the Witch book is like about trusting people and, you know, his family, like there's a lot of family stuff going on. So I tend to look at that when I'm editing. Now, am I doing it good enough? I don't know. Laura's probably going to tell me when she returns.
Oh, no, I have my own theories of how I do it, but it's not like I think.
No, I was going to say, I was going to say, Laura probably going to tell me if I'm doing it effectively or not.
Oh, in your book. Okay. I was like, oh,
so I tend not to think about it in the first draft, at least, or like I'll have like an idea. Like, so I went in thinking this character doesn't trust people, and one of the themes is like learning to trust other people, and so I had that idea kind of going in, but I wasn't trying to like force it in. And then in editing, I try to implement it more.
Yeah, I think, and I was thinking about this, that I do definitely write very thematically, and I was trying to think like, do I come up with it beforehand? And I honestly think I do, and I don't know if that's good either, but I definitely don't, even though I know it, and as I'm writing, I kind of keep it in the back of my mind, but it's definitely something that I don't keep at the forefront when I'm drafting like a first draft. I kind of have an idea of what I want, so that which will naturally make some scenes come to me for a draft, like because I want those points to kind of happen for that theme. But I definitely think that, and I know I haven't been doing it yet in the revision, I like what they said to go back to sort of each scene and look at how is this scene pushing it towards that theme? How is it addressing that theme? And is it? Because I don't know that I'm writing all of it in every scene. You know what I mean? Like I was kind of looking at it more like, and I definitely liked the discussion of like how to use word choice, symbols, and senses, not as just to have them for description, but to have them for theme, to help enhance the theme of your book. That was extremely helpful for me, because I hear the senses stuff all the time, like, oh, you should use all of the senses when you're describing things. And so I feel like oftentimes I will come across writing in my own as well as others where they just feel like they're randomly putting what something smells like and feels like and whatever, just to like have more description when it feels unnecessary. And I feel like the theme section is trying to make you be more purposeful of those elements and ways that you can use them constructively to actually do something to the book other than just describe it better, if that makes sense.
I like what Phoebe said in chat. She said, for me, the theme is there, but it's hidden even for me. And only as I write a later draft will I be like, oh, that's what I'm writing about. And then I strengthen it. That's I think that's similar to what happens to me.
I also think, because I've been reading all these craft books is making me be very introspective about my own writing process, why I do what I do, why I pick the themes. And I realized that like a lot of my themes are kind of the same. Must be some sort of issue I'm dealing with on a personal level. So that's probably why I already have them in mind before I start the draft, because I think I'm just working through some of my own issues and rewording them differently in different book ideas. So if you want to psychoanalyze me, just look at my catalog of drafts and you'll see exactly what kind of issues I'm dealing with. So I think that's why. But I think it was good that I noticed that, because it's like, okay, do I want all of my books to have the same theme. Like, no, I don't. Like, I want to explore other things that I think are important other than my own neuroses. So it's going to make me think more about theme in later projects, you know, to make sure that I'm not just kind of regurgitating the same story differently.
I think it's cathartic, though, to
of course
write it like that.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like it's also just like your kind of author brand. Sometimes it's like similar sort of themes and that sort of thing. Like I always end up writing characters that like have no idea what they want to do with their futures, even though I'm very regimented and completely the opposite. But they do it in very different ways. But it is like a continuing theme that like comes up is like characters that have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah, I've noticed the continuing theme of mine is that all of my characters have things that happened to them in the past, and they've got to learn sort of like constructive ways of incorporating their past into who they are as people and not let it be like so detrimental to them. So it's like how to sort of deal with your past and like that sort of theme of like accepting your past and not letting it victimize you or sort of, you know, hinder you from things that you want in your future.
You guys just made me realize that something I write in all my books is, which is definitely something for my own life that I'm trying to work on, is needing outside love to feel validated and feel like you're loved, like you crave it from outside rather than looking inwards to love yourself. So that's something I just realized that I need to talk to a therapist about.
We're all exercising our demons here. Just
Oh God.
Yeah, I thought that theme section though was really, out of all of them, the most helpful, because I think it is what is talked about the least, and I think it's because it's hard to talk about. Like, people don't know how to come up with a theme, they don't know what it is, what should it be, you know, that kind of stuff. So I did feel like that section was helpful of trying to get you to think about it and pull it out and how to make it work. Especially, like I said earlier, the senses section. One of the things that I liked about that in particular was the examples they gave were not, when they were talking about how to describe senses. So for example, like smell in particular, instead of, how do they word it? It was something like, instead of trying to describe a smell by thinking of other smells, they described the reaction that the character has to a smell, and then which allows you to pull your own memory of that smell, if that makes sense. So like instead of saying like, oh, the cinnamon buns, no, the example they give is from The Fault in Your Stars. We'll use that one, right? Vomit. She didn't say, oh, the vomit smelled like Cheetos and Diet Pepsi and whatever. It was like the vomit made her like gag and made her feel the smell of it. She said the smell of the vomit made her like gag. And it makes all of us then pull up our own like memories of what vomit smells like, if that makes sense, rather than describing it, which I thought was good because it's making the reader connect it to their own experiences rather than being told what vomit smells like. I don't think anyone needs to be told what vomit smells like. You know what I'm saying? So like I just liked that because I feel like I see that all the time. For example, when you're talking about how boys smell good in books, it's always like, he smells like sandalwood and lavender and star anise, and you're like, I don't even know what that combination smells like, right? Like just randomly throwing things out there. Because we're trying to capture what a good smelling boy smells like, you know, or girl or whatever. I'm just speaking for my own writing. So I like the idea of thinking more about the reaction to the smell to get your reader to just kind of imagine that smell that they've experienced before rather than trying to explain it in a way that doesn't even connect or make sense.
I'm pretty sure I did that in the witch book. I was like, his cologne smelled like blah, blah, blah. So now I fix that.
I was just using that as an example because I know it's something that a lot of people, we do. We're trying to describe, because it says in the book that like trying to describe smell is incredibly difficult. How do you describe smell? Like,
yeah. I just poke fun at it in my book. I'm like, he smelled like cloves and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, wait, that's his deodorant. That's the same deodorant my grandpa used to make. Is it weird that I'm enjoying this and now it smells like my grandpa who is dead? Okay.
But yeah, I just like that sort of like nuanced way of thinking about how to describe things differently and still having the same effect.
I just also wanted to say thank you via Laura for Cassandra Wrights gave you a super chat.
Oh. I have to pull the chat up. So
thank you. I like the unicorn.
Yay.
Lauren Clark said he smells like regret.
I love when people say like clean clothes and soap, because that's a good smell. When somebody just smells like clean, like they use fabric softener and something other than a bar of soap, it's like, oh, okay, this person actually cares a little bit.
I just don't like describing smell because I don't actually like smelling things and I don't like smelling people, and so I actually skip it. I'm like, I don't know what my boyfriend smells like because I don't like smelling things.
There's just I understand though what they're saying though about like the reaction, because I can vividly remember, because unlike Liselle, I like the smell of a good smelling boy. And so like I remember like in high school like smelling like my crush's cologne, and like it sends like this shiver down your spine, and it's like you get goosebumps because like you're like, oh, he's near, which sounds creepy, but
I think that's nice.
See, I'm thinking about, in terms of my own book, like smell comes up a lot because she has like post-traumatic stress disorder. So when she has these flashbacks, smell is one of the first things that you have when you have these sort of flashbacks, is like you remember how things smell in those instances. So I've been trying to think of ways to incorporate that and not be just so like literal of like listing things, you know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So because it is important to those sort of scenes, like to have it be so visceral, because that is what happens, a lot of times. So
Taylor put in chat ... he's near in all caps. I'm never gonna live that down. He's near.
But yeah, so I really liked that because I felt like it was good because it was talking about theme, but it's also talking about just like sort of general writing, some general writing advice as well that I think could be applied to other situations.
Yeah, that's what I liked about that section. It was taking stuff that like you're told to do in your writing, like you got to put in symbols and you got to put in metaphors, but nobody ever tells you why that's important at all. Yeah. It's just like, well, that's how you make good writing. And this section really explained that more. This is why this section I was like, oh, this is gold and this is perfect. And I'm like, why would you put this at the end?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
That was the great thing about it. And especially like using like metaphors and symbols to reinforce your theme, because for me, when I use all that stuff, I'm using it purely for voice. So when I do like description and metaphors and that sort of thing, I'm doing it so that my character's voice can come out. And that's always been my focus with that stuff. So like she likes cooking, so she does cooking metaphors, and there's like cooking symbols to describe her life and that sort of thing. But like relating that back to theme was definitely something new that I had learned from that. And I was like, oh, okay, like that's really good. And I can see myself wanting to use that going forward.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's exactly what I focus on as well, as the voice, like using simile and metaphor to make a distinct voice for your character and to understand who your character is, because that's what makes someone distinct, is what they which we learn in Story Genius too, it's like what they compare things to, because whatever's in their past is how they're going to associate everything. So when they're describing things, it's always going to be sort of through metaphor and simile of what they choose. Like I choose something different than you would choose to describe something. And so I've always just focused on it in that way and not so much to like reiterate theme, which was really helpful to think about too, for sure.
That's something that I really like too, because like you said about how your character likes to cook. So she thinks a lot of things in that retrospect. Is that one of my past books that I've really been wanting to go back to? He is a baker, so he thinks a lot. At least I tried to have him think about things a lot in like terms like that, like very exact, because baking is a science. Like you can't just throw in whatever you want. So I was like trying to make him like that, but I don't think I'm doing it effectively. So Liselle, I need to read your book so I can see how you're doing it. But I like that section in the book because yeah.
And I like this idea too that Priya says here, I learned my MC likes animals because I kept writing metaphors related to animals. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the discovery of theme, right? Of like what you were saying is like sometimes these things emerge in your drafts, but then when you go back to revise, you can remember that and find more places to be more purposeful and sort of refine doing that, something that you were already naturally doing by going through the draft and looking for those instances. Because I'm telling you that a lot of you are writing symbols and you're just not realizing you have recurring images that have come up that you're doing naturally already. And so after you've written that draft, you go back, you look for that repetition, and then that way you can enhance it by noticing it, how it emerges, and then reapply in a revision.
I think that something that all writers do, whether or not we realize it, is we can go in with ideas of what our theme's going to be, but naturally a theme will emerge. So there's always the theme you're aiming for, and then I feel like there's always another theme, because like your book can have more than one theme. So like I believe that writers go in sometimes with an intention of one theme. Some people just go in, like I said, like I do, which is whatever. But I have gone in with certain themes, and then other themes arise. So I think that that's something to think about when you're going back and editing, is to look for the one that you intended and how you're implementing it, and the one that maybe naturally came up by itself and how you could implement that.
100%. And also thinking about the senses, I remembered another thing that they use, and I wanted to ask you guys how you do this, but they also talk about foreshadowing. Now, Kevin, I know in your witch book there's some foreshadowing, because there's some literal like foreshadowing happening. I won't give too much away out of your book, but I'm just wondering how much foreshadowing you guys do in your writing, because they do talk about how you can use the senses to also foreshadow, which I thought was really smart. I never would have. They said that we often rely on visuals for foreshadowing, or like, oh, we see this like flower die, so something beautiful is probably gonna die later or disappear, you know, like Beauty and the Beast and the Rose, you know, like it's always like through images that we see this sort of foreshadowing. But they're saying that, you know, like try to do it through other senses. And I never thought about that before. And I really don't know if I even foreshadow anything in my book.
I'll let Liselle go, because she's one actually has a book coming out. So.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I wasn't even going to talk about my book that's coming out. I was thinking about my horror that I'm working on.
Well, yeah.
But like there's a lot of foreshadowing in that, specifically because I have like quite a big twist in the middle. And so now more than ever, it's like I have a lot of bits and pieces that are kind of helping lead up to what's going to happen. But I don't know if it's like correct foreshadowing. It's mostly just like mentioning things creepily without explaining.
Like breadcrumbs, you know? Yeah.
So like in the beginning, it's like very obvious that there's something sort of strange. There's a strange relationship between my main character and her mom, even though on the page her mom seems normal. So it's kind of a little bit like what's going on behind the page. And then later on you find out what is happening. But I can't do that when I'm like writing or drafting.
No, I definitely don't think it could be something you could do in a draft. Like,
yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, like I don't, especially in my contemporary books I've written, I don't think I do any foreshadowing. I mean,
that's what I was wondering, like in terms of genre, right? Because I think that it lends itself to certain types of writing more, like horror, suspense, thriller. And I'm just wondering, like, is this something we should be more mindful of in different genres, like contemporary, like romance, like, you know?
Well, I will say, like in my first contemporary that went on submission, there is talk a lot about a character from the main character's past. And that character comes back later in the book, and it's supposed to be like kind of like a surprise. But I feel like you kind of, I don't know if it's foreshadowing. It's just something you expect to happen because it's being talked about so much. But is that foreshadowing, or is that all those breadcrumbs? I don't know. So I don't know if I said, like in the witch book, I try to do some foreshadowing, but like I don't know if I don't know. I honestly don't.
I feel like the breadcrumbs are still technically foreshadowing. Like at the end of my debut, I do very like kind of similar thing. Like it's, you know, she has this kind of confrontation with a character and she's like, I kind of feel like things aren't going to go well with me and this character. And then later on, of course, that's what happens. Yeah, it's like, is that foreshadowing? I think because in literary books, like foreshadowing is so like dramatic. Yeah. Like it's like the candlestick fell and it lit a small flame. And then at the end, the whole house goes up in flames. They're like, it's like, like that.
We've been watching Riverdale, my husband and I, and there's so much foreshadowing of things to come. Like they'll say something, I'm like, oh, well, that person's gonna die later. Like they're just like little things they do that I know, okay, that's foreshadowing something's gonna happen with that. That's gonna come back up, you know? But again, that's more of like a suspense, like thriller. And so I'm just wondering, like, if say like because I write mostly right now I have ideas for other things, but I write in contemporary. And I'm just wondering, like, how, like, I don't know, like, how, like, do I need to be thinking about foreshadowing? And also because they're talking about foreshadowing in a much less literal sense, because I feel like a lot of ways, at least I have done any sort of foreshadowing, is sort of how you said, where you kind of say something, right? Like, where you know it's going to come back later. But they're sort of talking about, like, the spider web in the background or whatever, you know, some of these things are foreshadowing something wicked will happen later. And I'm just wondering, like, if that's more literary or lending itself to certain kinds of genres, or if really we should be thinking about this in all of our writing, like even, like, say, for example, a romance or something.
I think
I'm just curious what people think, you know.
Well, here's what I'll say. Like, I've read romances where they have drop some breadcrumbs that, like, oh, you can tell, like, oh, this is going to be a problem for them later, and it causes them to fight and have, like, their falling out. So I guess, like, that's kind of like foreshadowing, but it's, again, like Liselle said, like, I think of foreshadowing because of how I was taught, like, in school, as, like, this big dramatic, like, the candle is going to burn down the whole house. Like, I don't think of it as, like, these subtle things, which I think is a me thing, and it was the way I was taught about it in school.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I was taught in school, like, foreshadowing is, like, this character's going to die, so have them see a black cat with a skull. Like, it's,
yeah,
that's a little over the top.
Agree.
Yeah.
And that's why, and I picked this quote from Taylor in the chat, like, it's kind of hard for me to differentiate between laying down plot points to pick up later and purposeful foreshadowing that is supposed to seem, like, faded or sort of supernatural or, like, alluding to that. Yeah, and that's where I'm kind of, like, thinking about it, because I'm just like, well, should I be doing this, or do I even do this at all, like, without realizing, you know?
Yeah, one kind of feels like the plot point pickup, and, like, foreshadowing to me feels like it becomes a literary device.
Yeah,
like, one is plot based and one is, like, literary based, like it's in together with, like, symbolism and that sort of thing. And I think that's what foreshadowing feels like. And I feel like genre-wise for me, like, that's a lot more apparent and constant in my horror. And it's because I need to do that to set the atmosphere, because foreshadowing makes people uncomfortable. And it's kind of like, it becomes a requisite of, like, a thriller or a suspense or a mystery. Like, you want to build that sort of feeling, versus in, like, a fantasy, I'm not, maybe if I was doing, like, a darker fantasy, but I'm not really, or kind of, I don't know, you did that. Hard to explain.
Yeah.
But it's not really the same, right?
Yeah, and I think, like Lindsay said, she feels like foreshadowing is in a non-mystery way, isn't necessary, but adds good layers to a story.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it might elevate some of the writing and make it, and I think that's what they're kind of saying in the thematic section, that if you can incorporate some of these things like symbolism and metaphor in these strategic ways, it will enhance the reading experience and make your reader, make them deeper scenes, right? Make these deeper and more connected. I don't think you have to. I think you can have a great, I mean, we all like, you know, little brain candy things that are just fun or light or whatever, and you can, it still sits with you, you still enjoy it. But then if you want these scenes to be deeper, if you want them to resonate on a deeper level with your reader, then that might be something to try to incorporate, you know, as sort of like foreshadowing and things.
Like you said that we all like to look for it. Grape said, I look for foreshadowing in everything. The wind moves the wrong way, foreshadowing.
I actually, it's funny you say that, because now that I think about it, I feel like that too. I do that all the time. Like I said, with Riverdale, I'm like, oh, that means something. And Aaron's like, I don't think it means anything. I think they just wanted a milkshake. And I'm like, why are they always drinking milkshakes? The milkshakes are going to come back. It's going to mean something.
But I feel like I do that genre-wise too. Like, I do that when I'm watching thrillers and, like, horror and that sort of thing. But if I'm watching, like, a comedy or something, like, I'm not looking for foreshadowing or anything. I'm just looking for, like, that thing you pay attention to it as a reader. And I think it was, which book mentioned this? I'm not sure if it was Story Genius or Save the Cat, but, like, if you put something in there that doesn't have a purpose otherwise, people are going to notice it and they're going to think about it and they're going to wait to see you come back to it. And when you don't, you make people upset.
That was Story Genius that said that. I remember that.
Oh, go ahead, Kev.
I'd say, for instance, like we watched the new movie Palm Springs last night, which is kind of, I mean, it's not really contemporary because like they're stuck in a Groundhog Day situation, but there were things in that I was like thinking in my head, like that's going to come back, that's going to come back, this is foreshadowing. But again, that's not really a straight contemporary about, like, it is a Groundhog Day situation, so it's kind of like science fiction-y, I guess, but it's based in the real world. So like I don't know if that counts, but I was looking in that instance, but I agree that like when I'm watching like a romance movie or like a rom-com, I'm not necessarily looking for these threads. But I think it's because we're kind of taught as people to go into thrillers like trying to figure out the mystery. Yeah. Whereas we're going in for a rom-com, we're just there for a good time. We're not trying to think about it.
Unless it's like a trope where it's like, okay, it's obvious this is going to come up. Like,
you
just broke up with your boyfriend and now you are with this new guy. And so we know that your old boyfriend is going to pop back up and confuse you. Because that's what happens.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good point, that it's in certain genres we are expecting those things to be put in, and so we're looking for them and kind of wanting them. I don't know that I look for them in other things, but there are certain things, like you were saying in one of the books, that you have to be careful not to introduce certain things that people will expect to come back later if they're not going to, and it's usually things that like stand out or kind of are like, it's kind of hard to like identify what it is. But I used to do this exercise with my writing students. I would have them, we would watch a Pearl Jam video, because I'm that teacher who tries to be cool and relevant, like show things that I like. But there's this Pearl Jam video where it's talking about, it's an old one, Jeremy, and it talks about like school shootings and stuff. And what very purposefully is never shown in the whole video is an actual gun. Even though that's what the whole video is about, it's about school shootings, but it's trying to look at the other aspects of school shootings, like bullying, parenting, society, like things like that. And so we talk about, okay, well, what would it change if a gun is introduced, right? Because it deters it when certain things come up or certain things are shown, it demands your attention. And so the attention goes to that and not to the other things that you may be trying to bring attention to. So it was like a very purposeful choice on Pearl Jam's part to not actually show a gun, because they want you to think about other things besides gun violence and gun laws. They want you to think about other issues of it. And so I think the same thing can happen in our writing, is that there are just certain things that are going to deter your reader to thinking that it means more than it is, or that it's going to do something different. So you have to be really careful with what you're introducing. But I don't know if there's like a way to know, like, oh, here are the list of things you shouldn't, include and deter people. I think that comes with beta reading.
Yeah. You need other people to be like, why did you bring up this? And then you never talked about it again. And you're like,
because it bothers me and stuff sometimes. Well, they'll bring up like randomly Aunt Millie, who blah blah blah, and there was no clear reason why they brought up Aunt Millie here. So I'm like, okay, so Aunt Millie must come up later. We're gonna circle back to Aunt Millie, and then Aunt Millie never comes up again. So the whole damn rest of the story, I'm waiting for Aunt Millie to come back. It's important.
I have two things to say about that. One, I definitely do that because, like, for instance, my critique partner, Cassidy, she'll be like, oh, this is definitely going to come back up. And I think in my head, like, no, the hell it's not. So I know that. But then it comes into play if you're writing a series. Because, for instance, I'm reading this Game of Thrones series. I'm like on book 4. And he does introduce things that happen in, like, book 1 that just completely are done. But they come back up, like, 3 books later. So then I guess I wonder, though, when does that come in that you have to keep in mind that, like, maybe Liselle is going to have this come up in the 3rd book in her trilogy. But so she wants to introduce it early on. And then people are like, well, this is irritating, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, I think that's like the struggle I'm having, because there are things I do that in the
well, here's my question.
Close the loop is what I do. So like because I just finished drafting my sequel. So there's stuff and like characters in the 1st book that come up that are then like pulled into the 2nd book and like expanded more. Mm-hmm. And like my thing that I'm trying to do, whether I'm successful at this or not remains to be seen, but I try and like close the loop. So I've introduced this new character, but their role in the 1st book has been closed. So then it kind of feels like you're done with the character, and then I like pop them back up in the 2nd book. So like one is like a family member, and which main character like does a ritual with the family, and then that ritual is over. So she's interacted with that character and like maybe they don't even stand out that much. But then in the next book, I like pull them back in. So it's like, okay, I remember this person from here and I remember that they came up and like now they're in this book. But like in the first book, all those little like pop-ups have like had their own little first book purpose and then it's done.
So is it like
it's not open-ended?
Yeah, so like if it's a season of a TV show, you had them pop up for that episode and you check that episode off. Okay, I need to keep that in mind then when I'm editing because I'm wondering if I have issues with that.
Because I was thinking about that, Kev, when you mentioned Game of Thrones, because you said that he'll say something in season 1 or book 1 that will not come up again until book 3. But in book 1, did you feel like it needed to come up? Because I think it's when it doesn't, and then it does end up coming back in book 3 that you're like, wow, that's some really good writing. Because you thought it was just like a random thing that doesn't matter, that will not resurface. I think the problem is, and I don't know how you know this other than getting beta readers, is that sometimes things don't feel like they were complete. And so that's why they feel like it's going to come back up. So I think the skill is to make it seem like, okay, that circle's complete, that thing has been used, and we're done with it. And then to be able to have it resurface later with a new purpose, a new circle for you, just adds layers to your writing and makes things like compound, but you didn't feel like it had to happen.
Well, what I'll say is he was probably a bad example because he just like left and right. He'll like do like a one-off mention of a character, like just like in passing, and then like 2 books later he comes in and saves the day, but then gets murdered, and you're like, I don't. So he was a bad example. I didn't use him.
I do like though when you'll have like say like a character that you think is like the lunch lady, right? Not really important. She gave you your slop and you moved on. But then later, something in that scene, lunch lady comes back and it's actually more important. And then you remember that scene and there was a subtle thing in that scene that you didn't even notice. It was just the slop, but it was, you know what I mean? I think that's actually really good writing when you can do that, when no one's waiting for you to follow up with the lunch lady. But when
I think I'm just jealous.
Huh?
I think I'm jealous because I don't know how to do that effectively. Like I want to be able to do that. I want somebody to be like, that's that character from earlier. I can't believe that he did that. And I'm just not a good enough writer yet, I think.
Honestly, and I don't know because I have not written a million books or even completed anything. But I feel like that's something that comes in from several revisions, like revisions on revisions on revisions that you layer and deepen and add these little sprinkle things. And I think that when we try to rush stories or only give them 1 revision, 2 revisions, we're not going to get that layering and you're not going to get those opportunities to foreshadow, to bring things back in, to sprinkle little breadcrumbs that people didn't even know were there. You know what I'm saying? I think that comes from really spending a lot of time on the revision process.
Mm-hmm. And that's hard with series too, until you've like actually done it. Like I'm writing my series and I'm like, ha 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 ha, I put this thing back in that I mentioned very briefly in the first book and I'm so clever. But who knows if that's actually effectively coming across.
Yeah, I am. So I have a question, I guess, specifically for you, Liselle. Like, how much, like percentage-wise, just like an estimate, would you say that you think like you're purposely doing these things, and then there's you're outlining the second book, you're like, oh, I can bring this back in. Like, do you think that happens more like randomly, or did you have a lot of this planned out before you went into it?
For me, it's mostly randomly. Like something will pop up into my head and I'll try it. I'll be like, oh, this is like amazing. Like my first draft of my first few drafts, like when I got my agent and she was like, put in subplots, and I thought of a subplot and it like, I feel very strongly that subplot made the book like 100,000 times better than it was. It like added in a special layer and like mystery and all this stuff. And after I thought of it, I was like, this is genius. But before I'm like, I don't know. Try and think of stuff and like it ends up expanding. But like Laura said, that's like after many, many revisions, you kind of can like think about things a little bit more deeply and get to that stage. At least for me, like my first drafts are notoriously bad. I need the extra revision to make it anything worthwhile.
And I think you also bring up a good point, Liselle, that like it was your editor who sort of commented that help. I think we need other people to read our stuff to help us pull those things out sometimes too. So like maybe you didn't see an opportunity for a character to do something or a thing to come back up, but a reader might say it and bring it up, and because you were maybe putting it there, but because it wasn't purposeful, you weren't noticing it, but someone else is going to notice and give you that opportunity, which is why I think it's really important to have other people reading your stuff, you know, people that are reading it for that other than like, I liked him, that was fun, you know, those are great too. You want to know reader experience, that's 100% important, but you also want to have people who are going to help pull stuff out of your book and enhance it as well.
For sure.
Which is my excuse for why it takes me so long to read your book, Kevin. I'm trying to help pull. Where can I see opportunities? That's my excuse. Victoria said something earlier that I wanted to bring up. Let me find it real quick. She said that she tends to. Okay, here it is. She said, I tend to think of foreshadowing as the bits I add in during edits that make the ending inevitable. That I think is actually a good way of thinking about it, is that adding those little layers and elements so that when you get to that ending, there could never be another ending because everything has led it to that. And I think that that's what helps because if you ever read a book where you're like, that's not how it should have ended. This should have happened differently. And so you don't want your reader to feel that way about your book. You want them to come to the same conclusion you've come to. And so if you think about foreshadowing or adding these little bits in there so that everything is leading your story to, and that's what she said, Lisa Cron says in Story Genius, that everything should be inevitable, right? Like, this scene is like, she says if you could, which I thought was a little controversial, but I'm here for it because I agree. And it was definitely happening in my book, that if you could just move scenes around, then they're not in the right, like, then they're not purposeful, right? That what the next scene has to be the natural progression from the last scene. So I think it's the same thing that you want to think about with this foreshadowing and stuff, is that you want it to come off that this is the only logical way this book could have ended. There's no other end. And that's how I feel about Hunger Games. Okay. And I do. I feel like PETA was always going to be end game. They were always going to have that, and that particular end game. Okay. That particular relationship, that they could have never ended any other way. It was inevitable. And I feel like it was led to that direction, that there was no other ending that book could have ever had. It was perfection. And that's just,
I was very pleased with it. Cat piss forever.
Cat piss forever.
Yes. So, but that's what I like, is like when you get the ending and then you're like, no, this is the only ending it could have had. This makes so much sense based on all of the other things that are happening. So I kind of like that idea that Victoria said, that like trying to pepper those things in so that the ending seems inevitable, like it had to have ended this way or come out this way.
So going back to Game of Thrones, which I know not everyone likes, but I like that because he does that too. It's like when something happens and you realize that the foreshadowing is all bringing this, but then there's like so many fan theories, like, well, what if this goes to this? And that's just always been my goal. I want to write a book where people like think they know where it's going, but then when they're like, oh, it was actually going to this, but it still makes sense, because it's still got to make sense. And his stuff does, but because it's a little open, people are like, they theorize, and that's just, I don't know. I always want to write a book like that where people think they know where it's going, but then it doesn't, and they're like, oh, this still makes sense though. And I think that's something that you gotta be a really good writer to do.
I kind of disagree with that in that, and I haven't read, I've only watched Game of Thrones, so I can't. I'm not speaking to him specifically, but I actually feel like if there is all that open-endedness and you could see it going in all those different directions, then it wasn't purposeful. It's
very different in the book.
That way, if that makes sense.
Well, like, so the way he does it in the books is like he'll like foreshadow like something's gonna happen, and the thing is that like he does it to a way where it makes sense that it could go to this, but people think it's going to something. So I guess I see where you're coming from, but it makes more sense in the book context.
I've heard authors who've had like theories about their books, and they were like, you know, I thought something like, oh, I never thought of that. It could have been that too. Like where, like, I think some writers are not as purposeful at some of that stuff. They just made a decision and went in that direction, and it very well could have gone. And I don't think that's bad or good. I'm just saying, I don't know that makes good writing, that they left it so open-ended that you could have a million other theories.
I love fan theories, though. I'm
not saying there's anything wrong with that. What I'm just saying is that I think that I've heard so many authors just say, like, you're giving me way more credit than I actually was trying to do. That's what I think. I think that it does speak to a very sophisticated plot line or story that you can have so many different ways it could go. So in that way, I think that's a good way of writing, that like it's not just so clearly linear, but there are so many directions you could take it. Like that's fantastic. I don't have any sort of ideas that for books that can go in a million different directions. So I do think in that way it is.
It makes me wonder what people consider like good foreshadowing,
Yeah.
It's so confusing.
Yeah, because like if I think about like English class, like what was supposed to be good foreshadowing was stuff that I wasn't noticing. And I'm like, is it good if you have to super dig to get it? Or like...
Well, that's a whole other conversation too, because then you're talking about like highbrow, lowbrow, right? It's like where you get the argument like, oh, like they're so smart and they're saying it in such a way. But if 90% of the people don't understand it, then is it actually the best writing or is it the worst, right? Like it depends on your perspective of that, because that was something I came across in graduate school, is that most people that go to graduate school and become things like professors and academics, they come from a long line of people like that, right? Their grandparents went to college and had a PhD. Their mother had a PhD. So this is something that like comes very naturally to them. Whereas me, I was a first generation college student. So to be in a PhD program where my parents didn't even go, like my dad barely finished high school, like, I still wrote my academic ideas in a very John Q. Public kind of way that anyone could understand my argument. And I would always get flack for that from other academics. Like, you're making your ideas too accessible, right? Like, you should elevate. Why explain it like this when you can use these big $20 words to explain? It's like, because I want people to actually understand what I'm trying to say. Because
that I think actually comes in a little bit into classism, where they want,
right, that's what I was trying to get at. Right?
Yeah, like they're like, only we can understand this, only write it for us, when you were trying to do it in a broader stroke.
Right. So when you're saying that you sat in an English class, and I'm saying this as a former English teacher, and they're telling you this is the best example of foreshadowing, that's a relative description of what's the best foreshadowing. If people can't pick up on it, if you have to have a certain level of education and experience to even pick it up, who's qualifying that as the best examples, right?
Preach.
So I mean, that's enough on a tangent, but I'm just saying. So I think, it's true. So it's just like, just because if no one's picking up on that, then it's like, So I think you need to think about, first of all, who is your audience? And that's what I kept saying when I was in graduate school. Like, my audience is not other academics. My audience is my parents. I want them to see what they can get out of literature, what they can get out of film, what they can get out of these ideas, and enhance their way of thinking and understanding experience. Not other people who are already thinking on that level. I want to speak to the people that matter to me. So I think that when we're thinking about foreshadowing or symbolism or whatever, we also need to think about our audience. And for a lot of us, for at least the three of us, it's young adults, right? So we want it to be accessible to young people and not so up there that only certain types of people who have certain experiences can understand and get them.
Girl, I want my next show. I want my book to be the next Riverdale. I want it to be a CW show. So I ain't trying to write highbrow. I want The Witches to be a CW show. So bad.
But I think that goes with a lot of art. I mean, because I collect toys, right? I collect things that are considered mass.
You don't say. I can see them all behind you.
But I'm just saying, to me, it's collectible art. And why some people don't consider it art is because it's accessible to everyone. Because it costs me $7 and I can get a bunch of them, and that somehow makes it less desirable, because you're trying to keep it. We put what is desirable at that which is out of reach to most people, and that's just not how I work. I'm the everyday man, like I like things that are accessible to everyone, because that is my experience.
Well,
I only went to the museums that were free. I only went to the art exhibits that were outside in public. Like, so I want to appreciate the art that is done that everyone can enjoy, that everyone can have and have access to. So I think that's how I think about my books, as well, which is why I left academia. If you really want to know, I felt like, why am I writing these books? you know, for like 4 people to understand what the heck I'm saying, and they're trying to make me talk a certain way and only have a certain audience. That's just not what I wanted. I felt like I could convey the same kinds of ideas and the things that I want people to think about and experience and feel in a much different way to a much broader audience.
I think it's because highbrow, really when it comes down to it, there are certain emotions and feelings that books hit, whether it's highbrow or lowbrow.
Yeah.
Lowbrow. I say lowbrow, but like I don't, you know.
We're not considering that. That's what is like,
yeah.
you know.
So like,
yeah.
There may be a literary fiction book that still, when it comes down to the core, is still about love and acceptance, which is what my books are about. So like really it's like who you're writing for, like you said. But you really reminded me of Andy Warhol, who believed that that's why people hated him in the art world, is because he believed that art should be accessible to everyone. And people hated him for it. So, but I think that really when it comes down to it, all books address the same emotions. It's just writing for certain levels, which is what Lindsay said, is that the whole point of white male highbrow lit is exclusion.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Which is why when I taught literature, you'll be happy to know I never taught a single white old man book ever. In the 10 years that I taught, I always picked stuff that was written in the last 20 years and by women and people of color, and that was it, because we've heard enough. No offense to any old white men that group, but I'm just saying, I doubt it.
In college, I took an American lit class, and we didn't read a single white old man. And it was amazing. It was like one of the best classes I've ever had, because a lot of times it's like you're reading the same things in college over and over again. And the teacher, she was so amazing. I loved her.
And that's why, like,
not a single white old man.
And that's why it is important. And I think about my own young adult books that I'm writing. You know, that's why I get mad when people scoff at children's writing, because I feel like I'm trying to do the same kind of thing that what we're considering high literary people are trying to do. I'm trying to get those ideas out to people. I'm just doing it differently, in a different kind of way. And that's why I would choose those books for my students when I would teach, because I wanted them to realize that, like, these emotions, these thoughts, these things are not just for these types of people. People like you, like me, also experience these things, and they're happening in all. We don't need to read those inaccessible books and try to decipher what Shakespeare is saying. Nothing against Shakespeare, but that stuff is so hard for people to understand when those same themes are being done in other books that are much more accessible and contemporary and will click with people different. Not that you shouldn't read Shakespeare, folks. Not saying that, but you know what I'm trying to say.
It's because core human emotions transcend just old white men and how they're describing it. It's like, that doesn't necessarily mean, like, sure, maybe for some people that's good to hear because that's how they're experiencing it, but really when it comes down to it, we're all saying the same thing, just in different ways.
And it's interesting to me, like, when people like look down on children's literature, because kids and teens are the ones that are in school actively looking into books and learning and looking for symbols and doing that on a consistent basis. Like, the average adult reading and looking for symbols and like actively engaging with text is like way more rare, because they're not in school. They're not already in that process of doing that, right? So it's kind of interesting in that case that, like, for whatever reason, like, you writing something for that audience is seen as like not correct. And then they'll give adult books to them and then say that teens are not mature enough to understand adult books, even though that's what you've given to them to learn in school.
Yeah, and like, young people are trying to figure out who they are and their place in the world and what it means to them and what they can bring to the world. And like, that's the most, like, for me personally, the most important audience. They're the ones who are still trying to figure that you have the most access to as well, because as adults, we're very already, although I'd like to think I'm still a work in progress, a lot of adults are very rooted already. They feel like they know who they are, they know their position in life, and they know, but when you have young people, they're still so malleable and they're still asking so many questions, and they want to learn and they want to think about who they are and are always trying to sort of figure that out. And that's the best time to present them with these ideas, you know, and to make those things accessible. And like you said, and they're going to be looking for those things more so because they're still in that mode of life, you know?
I think that personally, as people, we should always be learning and growing, but I hate to think that there's people that are so set. Like, I think that so many adults could just learn something by reading a book, but that's besides the point. But when it comes to accessibility, like, for instance, I took a comic and graphic novel as literature course in college, and we read comics and graphic novels and how they, when it comes down to it, are telling and teaching the same things as these literary fictions. And what's funny is it was taught by an old white guy, but he was so awesome. Like he knew what he was talking. He talked about. He did his whole master's thesis on comic books as literature, and so like accessibility is. And I hate this is a little off track, but I just hate that people look down on these things like young adult fiction, children's fiction, and comics, and graphic novels. Like we're all learning the same things. It's just how you learn them. Because for some people, maybe they can't read as much because for various reasons. So like the pictures help them, you know. So it's.
And also,
I have a lot of feelings about this.
With kids and young adults, it's almost harder because you got to trick them into learning things and think about stuff. You know, it's like, how do you hide the vegetables in the meal? You got to figure out, you got to be more nuanced to that. Adults will just eat their vegetables, you know, but we have to figure out how to sneak them in there. So, yeah, that's our little rant on young adults.
Yeah,
but I think it's related, you know, because we often think like, oh, we're writing for children, or oh, we're writing genre. We don't need to be doing things like symbolism, foreshadowing, blah, blah, blah. But I think that these things can be helpful and enhancing. And a lot of us feel like they're inaccessible to ourselves because we don't actually understand how they work and how to use them and how to put them. That's what I thought was really helpful about this section in the book, coming back full circle to the book,
yeah.
right?
We're closing this circle loop.
Was just that they're at least trying to get you to see how you can do it and how you can to incorporate that into your writing, and to not feel like it's inaccessible to you, that you are maybe already doing some of it without even realizing. Sorry, things are getting a little deep, you know, but I have a lot of thoughts about things. So I did want to bring up something Lindsay brought up earlier, where she said she says the best threads are the ones that are so well red herring that they can work for multiple avenues, and you're trying to guess which one the author is going to go for. So I think that's kind of what you were getting at, Kevin, that if they're being used as like sort of red herrings rather than
okay, yeah.
So that, I think, Lindsay, is a great way of sort of putting that, right?
Yeah.
That they're purposefully making you think. I was just trying to say that some people, and I would maybe argue probably George R.R. Martin, you're giving them a little too much credit.
Yeah.
Just because I've heard some authors say that, like, wow, I was not going for that at all, but good on you, you know. But
I just really hope that someday that was one of my publishing dreams that I don't know if I mentioned in my video, but I just want people to come up with like these crazy fan theories and like have this like insane fandom. Like that's what I want so bad.
I don't know. I think it's just because I don't come from a fan fiction background, or fan theory background, that I don't really think about those things in terms of like wishes, because I didn't write fan fiction. It wasn't popular when us old people, maybe it wasn't, I just didn't know about it.
I say because
I feel like it wasn't as popular for us oldies like me. People weren't doing that, you know. They weren't doing that kind of stuff. And I didn't even get the internet didn't come around till, you know, I was almost.
I think it depends on like also what fandom you were necessarily in, because like for instance, I feel like Harry Potter back in the day was so huge that like the fandom was really like nuts. So like for instance, I'm friends with Becky Albertalli Lores, who she wrote Harry Potter fan fiction. I think she wrote Drarry, or maybe it was Ron and Harry. I don't remember, but either way. So like I think it just depends on like what fandom you're part of.
She is my age, so
because Cassie Clare was part of like, you know, she was a big part of like fan fiction and fandom, and
controversial.
I have a lot of
but I'm just saying, if you're a near the same vintage, she was involved.
Fan fiction, she, you know.
So I think it's
who knows?
Mel James also.
Yeah. So I think it just depends on like what you were necessarily into in what the fandom was like online, because I feel like that really shaped a lot of us.
I agree. I think it was two things. I think it was internet culture in general, and then also certain types of things that came out at a time when I had I call it the dark days of my life, where when I first started, like decided that I thought I wanted to be in academia and I wanted to be a professor, and I was getting a lot of like peer pressure to not dabble in things like young adult and fantasy and things like that, that I should only be reading Hawthorne and Melville and, Hemingway and things like that. Although I was still secretly at night after I did my reading for school reading Princess Diaries. So
yeah, you were. She had like the first
14 books. I'm still reading it, okay? But
she had like the first 14 books.
I do. I love the Princess Diaries.
And then I started reading them. They're pretty good.
So I never really got rid of that stuff, but I didn't fully get into it because I thought that like I shouldn't be. And so I was never involved in the Twilight era or the Harry Potter era. So I just remember Kevin talking about him so much to me and I being like, I'm reading Moby Dick.
I was so into Twilight back in the day before I realized how problematic it was. I was like, oh, Edward's so dreamy. Also, via Laura, thank you, Cassandra, for the other super chat.
Oh yes, thank you for the cute little sticker, the little
rainbow.
I love it.
So I don't know. Anyway, sorry, it's getting off track again. I just really want a fandom someday.
Oh, just as a side note, real quick, because I just saw this. Taylor, let's see if I can find it in this. Taylor said, as an English teacher myself, I've got to say some of the best examples of foreshadowing I've seen have come randomly from kids that barely come to school who noticed it while digging a booger out. That was me, Taylor. I feel very seen. I was a kid who was always skipping school, and then I would just waltz back in and be like, I noticed this. I don't know, I may have been picking boogers, maybe, but I definitely wasn't eating them like apparently our president does. But that's a whole nother thing. That came out in the
I just try to ignore any news
about Trump that his niece said that he eats some boogers. So I don't know. It's a legend. Supposedly conspiracy theory. He eats some boogers. I don't know.
Allegedly, that's my conspiracy. Don't get sued.
Yeah. I'll rescind my comment that fan fiction was not for people my age. It was really just I was in college when that was starting, and I thought I couldn't.
You were a little shamed away from it. So
yes, I was for a very long time. I also then ended up, being very depressed because I wasn't being my true self, and that's when I, dropped out of PhD school, had a nervous breakdown, and the rest is history. Now I'm here. So.
I just want to, I want to say something about the book. So
yeah, for sure.
Specifically on page 73, they talk about showing the action of antagonists in memoir. And they said that you create tension in memoir by showing the contrast. Oh, wait, no, sorry, that's not the line I wanted to be. Even when there really is a villain in your memoir, it's important not to paint the villain antagonist as completely evil. Humans tend to behave badly out of a complex mix of trauma and tough experiences. I did agree and disagree with this line because I think there are people, like you said, like our president, who are just naturally bad people. I don't think that it necessarily comes from trauma and bad experiences. But I think when it comes to writing, because I think it's good for writing-wise. Real world-wise, I don't know, because I think there are some people that are just naturally bad.
So you believe in pure T evil is what you're saying.
But when it comes to writing, I think it's interesting to keep this in mind because no one wants a cackling, like, I got you, villain. It makes it more interesting when they're more nuanced and you can kind of understand, like Magneto in X-Men. Like, he thinks what he's doing is good because of his past experiences of trauma of being a Holocaust survivor. He's trying to stop his people from being oppressed in the way he knows how. So
I did not know that was Magneto's backstory, so that's interesting to me. So.
Yeah,
in the movies. I don't know.
Yeah, in the movies.
I was like, I've only seen the movies, but I was like,
I've never seen any of it, but that's fascinating. So
in the movies, he's a Holocaust survivor, and that's why he reacts the way he does. Is that he's trying to stop other mutants from being oppressed in the way he feels needs to be done is through violence. Whereas, I forgot his name.
Xavier.
Yes, Xavier believes in peace. And they're both working for the same thing, but in different things. So that was something I really kept in mind from the last book and in reading this.
Thanos also thought he had altruistic intentions.
Yes.
But tells you that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
But I think that makes. But I think that's a good thing to keep in mind when writing your antagonist. Like, the antagonist in the Witch book, for instance, they're both working towards the same thing, like, which is technically like control and blah blah blah, but like going about it a very different way. So I think it's something that's interesting to keep in mind when writing. So I really like that.
My counterpoint.
Okay,
I think
I'm ready.
what I like to think of is like the villain is the hero of their own story,
yeah,
but not necessarily altruistic. And I think of this because I think of like contemporary like sort of stories where like the villain is like a like racist person or like a transphobic person, and that like justification comes in to like do a sort of forgiveness for those people, and like sometimes that like rubs me the wrong way. And so it's like less like everybody has this like altruistic background. I think of it as just like they're the hero of their own story, and like what they're doing is heroism, maybe like really gross and not really acceptable, but you like can see that without necessarily being like, oh, okay, like I get why you're like this, but just kind of like I understand your perspective on this without permitting it.
I agree 100%. I think that's kind of what I was going for, but you said it way better than I did.
I just wanted to pull attention to Moon's comment because James and Frey, who we read for last month, said there was no reason to give villains backstory. Nobody
he said, yeah, he did. He really meant that.
He really did.
But I just think it's interesting. Like, I don't think that we should have a one-dimensional person as a villain. So, like, even if they are, like, I don't know, if like, let's say they're transphobic, like, because I still want to see their full self. Like, I'm still going to hate them no matter what. But I just think it makes a more interesting villain if I could get a full picture rather than just like, because like, for instance, I wrote a villain in one of my creative writing classes in college, and he was just homophobic. And my writing teacher said like, well, then automatically like he's just like this super evil person that we're supposed to hate. Like if we see more of him, it makes him, we still hate him, but he's interesting rather than just being this flat character. So
but do we want homophobia to be interesting? Do we want to understand their homophobia?
I think it's like well-rounded. Like you can kind of, or like you're just really, fleshing the character out more without like, I think it's that like permissive thing. And I bring this up because I had a friend who like wrote like Inner Racist, and their editor was like, but he's got to have some sort of humanizing something so that we can like kind of humanize whatever he's doing. And I think that's kind of like, it's that balance of you don't want to be permissive and you want to be like, oh, well, this person went through this, and so that's why this behavior is like okay. It's more like this is their thing that they're doing, and that's why they're doing this but like it's still
not justifying it.
Terrible. I think that sometimes this is really hard. This is honestly like a big thing I think about a lot, and I talk about, especially because when I was in graduate school, my area of research was trauma studies, and it is something that I just naturally always do is I try to understand why people do what they do. And especially as a sort of antiquated Freudian person, like Freud believes everyone has some trauma. Some traumas are different than others, but there's always that one, the first trauma that then influences everything you do sort of moving forward. And so I just naturally always try to think of why would this person do this. And I think it's because I'm the opposite of Kevin. I don't believe people are truly evil. But
certain people,
I just don't. But that's just coming from my own background of like psychology. But I think that when there's the mistake that if we're trying to understand why someone does something, that we're somehow excusing it, and it's not. I think it's really dangerous to not understand why people do things, because how can you avoid things in the future? Because when you make it seem like things are inevitable, like when you say something like some people are just evil, then that takes away our power and ability to be able to affect change, and we become powerless. Like, well, this is out of our hands. Some people are just evil. And I like to think more actively about how we can do this. So if you understand why someone behaves the way they do, it doesn't make it okay. It's not an excuse. It's an understanding, well, maybe this thing happened, or they were socialized in this way, or this one experience. So how can we maybe avoid this in the future? How can we combat that in the future? How can we think about these things differently rather than just looking at the after effect? But I do think we sometimes just think that like we're not you have to find that balance of not being permissive, of not saying like, well, she had a bad childhood, so leave her alone. She's allowed to smack you in the face all the time. It's like, no, but let's find out why is the girl smacking you in the face, so that we can stop eventually some other girls from smacking people in the face, you know? So I do think it's a hard balance to not come off like permissive. But it's hard because at the same time, like I use the example with Kevin, like do I want the homophobe? Do I want to understand him? Because I sometimes don't. Like, I don't want to understand why our president does and says some of the things they do. Like, I don't really care because it's still very hurtful, regardless of why you're doing it. You're ruining people's lives, you know. So I don't know. I'm just torn about the whole thing, I guess.
Yeah, it's a touchy subject.
Yeah,
because wanting to know how people tick, and then also like you both said, like not. You don't want to justify it. Like, you don't want to accept it, say it's okay to do these things, but still wanting to know why they are the way they are. But it's, like you said, sometimes you don't want to know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have to do a lot more thinking.
But I think these are important things to think about in terms of writing, because that's what we're doing. You know, we're writing. Because I know, for example, in mine, contemporary, and this is something that I kind of hate in, like, teen stuff, is there's always the mean girl. There's always a mean girl in high school. My book has a mean girl. There's always one. That's just sort of the trope that happens. But no high school mean girl is just mean to be mean. They're never just mean to be mean. And when you make someone just mean to be mean, it's cliche, it's boring, and it frankly just doesn't help anything. And I don't know. I just think that people are so much more complicated than that.
Well,
especially teenagers, they're not just mean because they enjoy being mean. You know, hurt people. You know.
Here's what I'll say: the best teen show of all time, Degrassi, did this perfectly, because in one character's point of view, they may seem like this girl's really picking on me, but then you see that girl's point of view and you see her home life where she's being abused, and you're like, this is why she's mean to other people. So I think that show did it perfectly, because they're showing the multiple different points of view. And Liselle, you have to love Degrassi. I don't care what.
I do not care for it. But I think that, like, what I find interesting that I've seen, like, done sometimes is they'll, like, make, like, a sort of equal foil. Like, that girl will have a brother that's in the same environment, but then, like, he's not doing that stuff. Mm-hmm. So then it's, like, that helps a little bit, because it's, like, okay, I, like, kind of get, but, like, he's not like that, so not quite permissive. But, yeah, it's a thing. I'm, like, in my head, I'm like, that's for contemporary writers to figure out.
See, that's why I like those, you know, those sorts of things. Like, because I like, one of my favorite books of all time is East of Eden, and that's essentially what it's doing. Is you have twins who come from the same background, but they're dealing with that same trauma differently. Like they're foils, you know. And so the idea, though, that you get through the book, the theme, coming back full circle, the theme is that you're not born evil. You have a choice. Right, you choose. Some of it's conscious, some is subconscious, but once you become aware of it, then you can choose.
What if a person refuses to acknowledge it?
Well, I mean,
now we're nature nurture.
I'm just referring. Okay,
nature nurture debate.
I'm still referring to our president. Like, I think that he really does think he's a good guy, not doing things, and he doesn't want to admit that what he's doing is bad. So it's like, at what point?
I don't think he thinks he's a good guy. I don't think he thinks that.
I think he thinks he's a good guy.
He doesn't care.
I think he thinks he's great.
I think he's bigly amazing.
So I honestly just think he doesn't care. He doesn't care if he's a good guy because it doesn't have to matter to him. So
that's what
I think you're giving him too much credit to even think about himself at all, really, in that way, very introspectively at all. I don't think
that's true. I find it hard to believe that he thinks introspectively at all, ever.
I think part of what he does is because he's just dumb. Like, there's not enough going on there, but that's neither here nor there. That's
anyway. Yeah, I don't know. The nature versus nurture when it comes to, like, antagonists too is so fascinating to me. And in fact, I in the witch book, there is a character, I don't know if Laura's gotten to the scene yet, where they come to contact with one of the antagonist people, and the main character, okay, so I won't give away too much, but the main character can have visions about things, like past, present, future. And he has a vision of one of the antagonists' past, and you figure out why he is the way he is. And it's like, but you're still a horrible person doing horrible things. So it's interesting to see, like, antagonists coming, like, why. I find that kind of stuff interesting, because I'm still going to hate him. He's still doing awful things. He's still murdering people. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting to see where he came from my point of view. And, like, the thing is, like, the character still thinks he's awful and he's doing awful things. In fact, he doesn't understand. It's like, why would you still do these things? So mm-hmm. I don't know. I just find villains interesting. That's why I really liked Marie Lou's second series. I forgot what it's called.
It's not Warcross though.
Like like the Italian Renaissance.
Italian Renaissance one, because it's a villain origin story. So you find out why she is the way she is, and like the whole first book is like her going through all these awful things, and it's like. So I think there's also different levels though, because like what you consider a villain is also subjective. Like I think we can all argue, like I don't know.
I think you kind of brought up a point, Kevin, that it's important for you as the writer to know why your villain does what they do, so that you flesh out that character, but that your MC doesn't have to.
Yes.
Understand psychologically why the villain does that. The reader or the writer, right? So that you're giving a fully fleshed out character. You have to, which is what she says in Story Genius, right? Which is write their background so that you know, so that when you're portraying them, you're portraying an actual rounded out person.
Like what Liselle said, like they all believe they're the hero of their own story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like making my villains. I like antagonists that people like despite themselves.
I'm not big on the like
Kylo.
I'm not big on certain, like I don't understand, which I think Moon really likes this person. So like I'm not big. I don't understand like the Loki love, like that kind of thing where it's like
I like Loki, but I don't understand why people are obsessed with that. Like
that's the kind of thing where I don't really understand. Like I just don't. I don't know.
That's what I want to create. I like that when people are like, because when I write those villains, I know that they're like flawed and they're not great, but I like to try and write them in a way where like people are on the fence about whether or not to like them. Because I like the moral conundrum of it.
I think Taylor makes a good point that also if they're attractive, it helps. But that is not why I'll die on this hill. Okay,
that's the Darkling effect.
Okay, because I know that I am in the minority of this, but I think Kylo Ren is some of the best character work I've seen. Okay, I'll die on this hill. I can argue this for hours. Okay, yes, Kylo's hot, but there's been a lot of hot people in movies that are villains that I don't like. Okay, so it's not that. I do think that we get a full character arc of Kylo and an understanding, and I think it's, but that's just me, and that's we could talk about that a whole other time.
Here's another thing that I don't understand. Back to what Liselle said, the Darkling effect. Granted, I've only read the first book in that series. I do not understand why so many people are obsessed with it. It's weird to me. I don't get it. So maybe I need to read the rest to understand.
Yeah, maybe you need to read the rest.
Because, I don't know, it just was like really weird, like a predatory relationship in the first one that I was like, why? I remember everyone posting about it on Instagram back when I was like into Bookstagram. People were like, I love the Darkling so much.
I feel like it depends on when you read it. Because I think when you're like more teenaged and you have not yet understood the predatoriness of it, you're like, no, I love the Darkling, and then you get older and you're like, wait, how old is he?
I think that's how I was with Twilight, because like when I was young I was like, yeah, Edward is like so hot and he like loves her, but then as I got older I'm like, he's like over 100 years old. It doesn't matter if he looks young, he isn't young. So
I have a real problem with that.
I think when I was young, because I was just like, he loves her and he's protected.
Because also when you're young you think it's okay to date people older than you. You don't realize it's not okay until you're older. I think back now, horrified, okay? Horrified. I was in the 7th grade dating a junior in high school. Why was the junior in high school who drove a car dating a 12-year-old? 12.
Well, isn't he in jail now?
No.
I thought he got arrested recently.
That's somebody else that I dated when I was in high school, okay? He was 24 and I was 17. And he had a job and his own apartment and everything, and I thought that was okay, But I'm talking about a different. But I'm just saying, when you're a teen, you also just don't realize that.
I just want to say, don't trust straight men.
Because you think you're grown. You think you're grown when you're a teenager. Like you think you're grown, and you don't see the predatoriness. You don't see the power imbalance. You don't see any of those things, and you literally can't see it because your brain is not done growing. I mean, that's just you can't. But. Something I kind of wanted to bring back from this book that I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit was, because we kind of have touched on this, but it's talking about when we're talking about theme, why it's important is because we want to ask, why are we telling this story? What do we want people to get from it. And I think a lot of times we aren't asking ourselves that question. We're just saying, I thought of this really cool idea, and I think it's going to be really cool, and people are going to really like it. It's going to be fun, and that's great. But I used to say the same thing to my students. I would say, why are you writing this essay? And they'd say, because you made me.
That's what I would tell you.
Like, okay, well, why did you pick this topic, and why did you write it in this way? Well, because I want to get a good grade. I was like, okay, well, let's pretend that those are not. Okay, you have to write it regardless, right? Because I'm making you. So if someone has to get something out of it, if someone is going to get something out of it, and they have to get something out of it, what do you want them to get out of it? What can they get from it? So I think that sort of like, that's what she was sort of implying with the theme section, is people are going to get something out of your book. They're going to make connections. They're going to sort of, pull things out of it. And that's why I think she was trying to say, like, they're going to do it regardless. So why not make it purposeful? Ask yourself, what do you want people to get out of this book? And I'm just curious, like, how often are you asking yourself, like, what do I want people to get out of this? Especially for those of us who are writing to young people, are we writing it for young people to get something out of it? Or are we doing, as I've recently realized, working through my own neuroses of some of these books?
I do that a lot more now. I think about it a lot more. And I think part of that was as a result of like being on panels and things, and knowing that at at points in my author journey, I'm going to be talking about my book and the things that I've come up with and what I want people to get out of it. And so at some point in the process, though I can't like pinpoint it, I started thinking of those a lot more. Also because I was listening to podcasts and I was like, ooh, I want to be a guest on a podcast. And then I was like, what would I talk about? And that's honestly, like, as embarrassing as it is, like, that's how I talk to myself about a lot of the themes and stuff in my books, is I think of, like, if this person were interviewing me and they asked this question, like, well, what does this mean in your book? And I'd have to say something, and like, what would I say about that? And then sometimes I'll come up with blank spots and I'll be like, oh, I have to fix this, which ended up being why for my debut, I completely redid my character sheet, because I realized that her goal was off. What she was like trying to do and like what her internal need wasn't quite aligning properly. And so I redid that. And then I was like, okay, this is it. And then in my next edit with my editor, I like went through the whole manuscript and made sure I was hitting on all of those points. So I think it's important to think about those things, because it's like they say in the book, like, they're going to decide that theme for you. So you may as well decide it for yourself and like know why you're doing all of the things in your book, because I think it gives you a lot more insight into what you're doing in the first place.
I'm actually sorry, my dog was whining for a second, so I had to mute. I think that you make a good point in saying that, like, you said, like, it's embarrassing to admit, but I wasn't really thinking about that. But I think that's the case, is that a lot of us aren't. Like, I think that's really fair, because we aren't thinking about it, and that's what I like that the book is making me realize, like, am I thinking about this enough? Am I doing enough to make sure that it is getting across too? Because I do feel like I think about it. I don't know that I'm looking at each scene and each section and making sure that people are getting that. I just know my intention, but I don't know if I'm properly conveying my intention to others. And it's definitely something, and that's why I said, to some extent, I feel like this is a little bit more than a 101, because it's making you stop and think about things on a much smaller scale, like a more microcosmic look at what you're writing rather than the larger picture. But where is this happening in each of your scenes, in each of your sections, in each of those sort of energetic markers, that kind of stuff. Kevin, you seem deep in thought there.
I don't know. A lot of times when I write contemporaries, at least, I think of it more from like a gay perspective. Like, I want people, I don't know how to explain it. Like, I'm writing what I wanted as a teenager. It's like what they're getting out of it. I don't know if I think enough about that. I want them to just feel seen.
Mm-hmm.
I guess.
Yeah. And I think that's a good question, because you said, like, you want to write what you wanted to see. I think a good question then is to ask yourself, why did you want to see that? Why did you need to see that?
we talked a lot about this yesterday on the diversity panel. It's like, because I wasn't seen, I didn't see myself, and if I did, it was because, well, the gay character's got HIV, AIDS, and is gonna die, or it's gonna be murdered, or they're just a sassy best friend. It's like, I want LGBTQ teens to know that they can be the center of their own story. They don't have to be a sidekick. And so that's what I'm trying to really convey. Is like, you can be a witch, you can see the future, you can, I don't know, fall in love, and you don't have to die because of it. So I guess that's really what I'm trying to convey. Is let people know that they are seen and normal. I got deep.
But I think, like we said, like the books are deep whether we're intending them to or not.
Yeah.
They're all pulling from our own experiences, our own neuroses, our own things that we're missing and we're wanting to see. And I think that that's why it is important to ask ourselves, what do we want people to get out of it? Because we want something, we want people to get something out of it, whether we're consciously asking ourselves that or not. So why not ask ourselves that, so that we are being more intentional with what we're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think we can all agree that the theme section of this was by far the more like meaningful or thought-provoking, or one that we sort of focused on. And I do think that as I've been reading a lot of craft books, it is in general what is talked about the least in craft books is focusing on theme and writing theme, and how to convey that. Like, as you said, Liselle, like they're not really always explaining like how to do it, where to do it, what's the purpose of doing it, and kind of how to get that across. And I was curious, we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, but what did you guys think about the reason why I'm asking about these examples is because for once, there was an example that I actually knew and felt like it applied to what I was writing, because they used The Fault in Our Stars, which I did not actually read, but I've seen the movie, so I know enough of the story to understand that example. And the reason why that was helpful for me is because I can get stuff out of books I haven't read. Like, I can see what they're talking about. But when it's a story that not only I am familiar with, but it's actually the closest to what I'm not writing another version of The Fault in Our Stars, but I am writing a contemporary. I am writing about certain deep issues. I am writing about a love story. There's a love story in it. There's these sort of elements that are the same, that I felt like that example was so helpful for me. And like I said, when I had that epiphany about my midpoint turn being wrong, it was because of The Fault in Our Stars example. Because when they explained what the second energetic marker was in The Fault in Our Stars, that is not what I thought the second energetic marker was in that book or in that movie. So when they said that, I was like, I don't think I understand what the midpoint turn is, because that is not what I would have chosen. I would have chosen something else. And there were several, because they kept coming back to The Fault in Our Stars. So there were several other instances of that where they were showing it where it happens in The Fault in Our Stars, and I wasn't picking up on that. So I think it was helping to solidify. So I was just curious what you guys thought about the examples that were used in this one. Because I know that this has been a controversial topic in all of the craft books, of the examples they use. So
I struggle with examples because, I don't know, sometimes I just find them really unhelpful. And especially when there's like 400 different stories they're talking about, it's hard, like, just pick a few. And I understand that they are trying to like pick certain scenes out of certain books or movies or whatever that do this really well. But I don't know, I just really struggle with examples. And even the one that I had, like, one that really stood out to me in this was Station 11. And that one example they used, I didn't really like the example. I love that book, but I just felt like it didn't really work for me, that examples. I really struggle with examples. For the most part, I do not like them. The one that I think did it the best was Save the Cat, because they really write the novel, because they really broke it down, like really intricately. And I feel like I don't know. I get that this one had to be more general because it was scenes rather than a whole story, but I don't know. Examples really don't work for me in books like this. And often I skip over them, if I'm being honest. Like, depending on which one it is.
Same.
I don't remember which one it was where you couldn't stop talking about Tootsie. I can't read about Tootsie.
Yes.
I can't do it.
Not Truby in the Alaska story.
So it's just like, I'm not going to keep reading about this movie. So I'm moving on with my life. Or like the one where they came up with the fake ones, which I think was James and Frey.
Oh God.
Where he came up with all the fake examples.
Ideas.
These are terrible.
Wait till you read Story Genius, Kevin, because while I liked that she chose a book that hadn't been written, she had a friend who was in the process of coming up with a new book. So she had her friend do the exercises. I actually liked that because I saw an application of the exercises in real time and like the pitfalls of that. But the actual book that person was coming up with was a terrible idea for a book. It was horrible. It was the worst. And I started to get tired of reading those examples because I didn't care about that stupid dog and her
my taste
dog. And it was so convoluted. It was such a convoluted book idea. I just couldn't. I remember I was like getting really frustrated. I was reading it. My husband's like, what's the big deal? So I tried to explain to him what the concept of the book was. And I was like, and then there's like this guy dying and there's like a dog. And then like her sister actually owns her house. But then she's also got this fangirl who wants to write the end of her series. My husband was like, what book is that? I was like, I don't know, dude. No one would ever read that book. I'm wondering if that book ever came out, actually.
That one is better because at least it's like one story the whole way through.
I like
so you can see everything.
Yeah.
I'm with Kevin though. I like usually skip examples. I like pretty much skipped all the examples in this. I don't find them helpful. I often found like, especially in this book, that they would explain it and then they do the example and then the example would just be doing what they explained. And I'd be like, I was cool with your explanation. I didn't need to see it.
I think it's just like two different kinds of teaching styles or learning styles that some people may need to see an example, but I'm not that person. So I don't need the 400 examples in this book.
Yeah.
I may need to see that. Some people may need to see it applied, but I don't.
I think that, like I said, the only one that I actually read all, like I would see what one they were using. And if it was something that I never heard of, didn't want to read, didn't know the general premise of it, I didn't feel like it was going to be helpful to me. So I would just read what they were saying about that
95% of them.
But I will say that with The Fault in Our Stars, it was actually helpful for me because I do know that story very well. And it is similar enough to what I'm writing that seeing it applied in that way actually helped solidify it and make sense to me. So I actually get why they use examples, and it's got to be hard to get examples that everyone's going to know and be able to apply. So I just feel like the nature of it, it's just you're never going to satisfy everyone with that.
Yeah.
But I do agree that at least with Story Genius, it was just the one, and we saw it in real time coming up with it. So I think if you could at least limit it to like the most popular horror, maybe the most popular, like of a couple of different genres where people could at least see it, that could be maybe more helpful. Well, there was way too many in this book. My God.
I agree that there's way too many in this, but I think the what you run into, like the issue you run into is if you come up with like the certain popular ones, is that it could be like it's not necessarily as long lasting. But then at the same time, if it's popular, people know it. So actually, I take that statement back. I take that statement back.
It's hard to know. The examples, I do think it's like what Kevin said about the learning style. Like, you know, depending on your style, like even Story Genius, even after like the first couple examples, I was like, skip. And then I continued to skip all of them. The only book where I've read all the examples is Hooked by Les Edgerton. And that's because it's all about beginnings. So every example is the beginning of a book. It's usually like a sentence to like a paragraph. At most, one was like 2 pages, but it's always the beginning of a book. So it was kind of like, regardless of my interest in the book, I could still like read a beginning and be like, this is good or this is bad, and then kind of like move on from it. But like when, I don't know, for me, like, especially when it's like pulled out of the middle of the book, I'm like, what's going on? And then I got to read your explanation so that I can be caught up to the example. And I don't want to do that.
There was way too much of that in this book for sure. Whereas like she was setting up so much of the book and I was just like, I don't need all of this.
Well,
I really don't.
I think the reason why I didn't like the Station 11 one is that she mentions that like, oh, this is like showing it's the reader will pick up on this, but the person in the book doesn't know what it means yet. And I read it and I was thinking in my head, like, because it tells you who this person is earlier in the book. And I read it and I was like, if you have not read this book, that example makes no sense to you. I know who that character is because I've read that book. That example does not work. It does not work in the situation she was using it unless you've read that book. Okay, it absolutely does not.
I didn't read the Station 11 examples because I want to read that book, and so I didn't want it to be spoiled.
It's such a good book.
That's the next thing too. right? Like the spoilering when you want to skip this, which is why the book about beginnings works, because I'm like, well, I'm not going to be spoiled.
Yeah.
Would you recommend that book, Liselle? Because I've been thinking about reading it, the Hooked book.
It blew my mind when I read it, but I read it a while ago and I've been meaning to reread it. But a lot of the stuff that I learned in that, I still use in all of my beginnings. And it's all like super helpful. Les Edgerton.
I'm just wondering if that stuff,
because a Writer's Digest book.
So is this.
Because what is it?
Yeah, Writer's Digest book.
Because I was wondering, because I'm wondering if it was like helpful because maybe you hadn't read other books that talked about beginnings yet, because I did feel like Story Genius brings up a lot of stuff about beginnings that I hadn't read yet and made me want to rewrite my entire beginning. And so that's why I was wondering, well, okay, would Hooked have anything new that I haven't seen in these other craft books that I've been reading?
Yeah, which is interesting. I've been meaning to read it again. I'm taking a week off of writing next week, so maybe I will read it again. Yeah, because it's hard to know, because I had read it because I was writing my second book in which I rewrote the beginning like 4 or 5 times to later realize that it was problematic. But at the time I was like, how do I crack this beginning? This is my only problem with this. And so that's why I read it. But yeah, I was like quite a bit more of a beginner, and it was like stuff like I was starting with dreams or like waking up in the morning. But then also I think to me, like the difference was kind of like it pushed a little bit more on your action and like drawing people in without confusing them, which was also a mistake I made, like starting with huge action in which people didn't care about the character. And so it doesn't matter that you have a huge fight scene, because if they die, I don't care, because I don't know who they are.
Interesting. Yeah, I might actually check that out then.
I might need to read that too then.
Okay, just because I have been thinking, I'm already planning to completely change my beginning just based on some of the stuff from Story Genius. So I'm like, well, if I'm already redoing the beginning, why not read a little bit more about beginnings before I get going on it?
There was a question specifically for you, Liselle. Speaking of taking a break from writing, do you do that purposely because you're feeling burnt out, or to refresh ideas?
I'm just doing it because I'm aware that I should. I could probably just start plotting the next day, but because I like finished 2 projects in a week, several weeks before I planned to, I was like, you should take a break as a sort of forced thing. And I'm sure I'll enjoy it. I'm just gonna like sit around and like watch anime and like get my some journaling. And then at the end I'll probably like plot stuff, because there's a couple new books that I want to get plotted. But I just like take it because I'm aware that it's good to take breaks. And I know that because I'm a productivity hoe, if I don't force myself to take a break, I will work endlessly until I eventually burn out.
See, I try to be a productivity person, and I can be with everything but writing for some reason. I think it's because it I don't know why. I can't do it the same way you do, and it makes me so jealous of your life.
I don't know. I'm weird. I just like to focus, I guess. But before I sit down to write, I like flop around in the house and I like avoid stuff. I think it took me until like 9 o'clock at night on Saturday to actually start writing, because not even 9 o'clock because we were in the thing. But like that was probably Friday. It took me until like 9 o'clock to start writing because I had just been avoiding it the whole day because I just was lazy.
What was I was gonna say something about that and then I forgot. But I definitely am not as productive as I'd like to be.
Liselle, you're like one of the most productive people, I think, an author too.
I'm also unemployed currently.
That does help with
yeah, and I put a lot of value on like my value as like a working person, and then I have no job, so I'm like, if I work on my writing, then I like I still have value as a writer, even if I can't find a job as a social media person, and like feel really down on myself about that. I'm like, just perk it up with the writing.
I think that's actually what Damien does, because he doesn't work full time. So he's constantly like, I got to do this comic, and I got to work for this person, and I got to finish my book, and I've got to finish on a new, like, he's constantly working. So I think he's similar, actually.
Yeah. That actually makes sense to me, because when we first moved back to North Carolina, thought I was going to go back into teaching and decided not to. So it took me about like 6 months to like figure out what else I was going to do and then like actually find a job. So that was when I've done the most progress in my book because I felt bad. Like my husband was working and I wasn't. And so I felt like, okay, well, I'm not just going to sit around. Like I need to be productive. I need to be doing something of value so that I not only feel like I feel better, but that I'm providing something of value to my family. Like, look, I'm productive. I did this thing. And that was when I, did the most of my writing. So
I think it's because as humans, we are told that we need to be productive to be successful.
This capitalistic society where we put value on output.
Yeah, it really is. And I do want to remind everyone in chat and just on the stream that, like, if you aren't being productive because of everything that's going on in the world, that's fine. But I think that we need to remind ourselves that there are huge issues going on in the world between pandemics and, Black people being murdered by police, that we need to remind ourselves that if we can't be productive, that it's okay, that we can't always be churning out, and that we're not capitalist machines.
Yeah, I did share that on my Insta story the other day. It was like, if you have not infected someone with the virus, you have been extremely productive. And so just be happy about that that is already being productive enough. Yeah. So there is value in that.
Absolutely. Which is why I forced my break.
So just to kind of like round things out, since we're getting here toward the end of the hour, I feel like the book had helpful stuff in it. Mm-hmm. I don't feel like it was controversial like some of the other books I've read in the past, where people are very opinionated and they see only one way. This felt actually more academic in that way, but not inaccessible, but rather just pointing things out and helping to explain things that are already kind of occurring in our writing, or already kind of doing it, just so that we can be more purposeful and mindful of what we're doing to enhance and refine what's already sort of existing. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, so I would my husband's speaking in the background. So you're fine. So I definitely think that I would recommend it, and I did get things out of it. But I definitely think that it some of this you're going to get from other craft books if you've read them. But that's why I think maybe it's a good companion.
I think it's good if you're struggling with theme. 100%.
Yeah.
You should get this book to read at least the theme section, because even if you don't think you need themes, or you don't know what you're doing with your themes, or you think you already know what you're doing with themes, I think this is a really good, that's talked about it in a way that a lot of books have it. So that's what I recommend the most, is the third section, the theme part. I mean, I think you should read all of it, but
it did make me pause and really think about my writing on a scene by scene level instead of holistically. What am I doing in the whole part of this, that like each scene, which I also just think is something I struggle with, period. Like I struggle with, when should a scene end? When should a chapter end? What should be in it? And actually that reminds me, that's what I was going to ask you earlier. I'm just out of curiosity, Liselle, since I know you like Story Genius as well, do you actually use the scene cards that she has when you come up with your scenes?
I don't use any worksheets from any books because I don't like filling them out.
I'm considering doing them for my revision, and that's why I was just curious if you had experience.
No, I don't use that. But for like Story Genius, like all that character, like Shard of Glass stuff, I pull out things from that I feel like I can dedicate to filling out. And that's what I actually use as like the basis of my stories. The scene stuff I don't use. I just kind of hold in my brain, and I'm like, this has to be important, and this has to like relate to this thing and come after this scene, and you can't just be able to move it around. And I just kind of like hold that in my head, but that's just like pure laziness. I just don't want to fill out the scene bit cards. It just like seems like so much work.
With what kind of learner you are, like we were talking earlier, because the reason why I'm thinking about doing it is I'm a very kinetic learner, and so like, even though I write my books on the computer, like I have to do all brainstorming by hand. All brainstorming,
I do a lot of my brainstorming
work, any of that, I have to do it by hand because I'm like figuring things out and learning. So like when I do math, or if someone asks me how to spell a word, I have to physically do it. That's just how my brain works. So like if my husband's like, oh, how do you spell blah, blah, blah? I have to like write it to tell him how it is. Like, yeah. I'm just very kinetic. So that's why I was thinking about actually getting those, like making those cards and sort of filling them out, because I think the actual act of doing it is going to help me process it and think about it better. So I don't know. We'll see though. Stay tuned because I'm gonna vlog it next month, whether or not it works for me. And because I am also very lazy.
Yeah.
Very lazy. So I don't know if I'll keep up with it. So
I feel like that's just like my planter nature. Like I can plot to a certain extent, and if I have to do any more than that, like I get tired. I can't do it. So like I can do the save the cat beats. I do my little character motivation sheet, and I can even like plan out some chapters. Like I can plan out like 5 chapters ahead. But anything else, like if I try to do like, I have how many scenes are in my book? There's like 40 chapters, so like 2 to 3 scenes. So like the idea of planning out like 100 scenes, I would die before I wrote that book.
See, that's where I'm at right now because I am like a very solid planter, like where I do some planning but not a lot, and I'm going to actively try to plot the hell out of this revision, scene by scene, every single one, and see if that helps. I don't know if I'm going to, but
I have to plot it. I can't I think it comes out of like part of it is from my anxiety disorder where I think about like just pantsing a whole novel and it causes so much anxiety. I think that's actually what I'm struggling with my adult novel right now is that I don't, because I haven't plotted it. I'm just like, I don't know what to do.
Genius.
I have pantsed an entire novel and it was so overwhelming, the work that it needed to be done to fix it, that I'd never gone back to it.
Yeah.
So I think it depends on the kind of person you are, obviously.
Yeah. But I think you should read Story Genius, Kevin. It will help you.
It is on my list. I mean, I need to read next. Well, I've already read. Yeah, it's on my list. It's on my cart. It's on my cart.
All right. Well, I think that was a great talk. I think we really talked about a lot of stuff, and hopefully we got something out of that book. I did, definitely. I think we all got at least something about theme. So, thank you, Kevin and Liselle, for reading and talking about this book. And we did not disagree on things, Liselle. We actually.
Yeah, I thought we were gonna.
I tend to like the blogs. I just say like, "Oh, it's good. It's good." I'm getting stuff out of it. Like, I don't really get too in depth until I think about it more.
I think it's because I gauged the overall feeling, and I was like, I don't know that I would recommend this. Maybe if it was just the last bit, I would recommend it, but it's not. So I don't know that I would. And because I liked it, I was like, I don't think I liked it.
I would recommend that if you're iffy to check it out at your local library or see it somewhere online.
At least for the theme section, I think it's very helpful.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like Liselle said, like she would recommend the last section. At least see if you can get it at your local library, and that way you're also supporting your local library.
Yeah, and that's why when I do my review videos, I try to say who I think it would help. Like, do I think if you've read Save the Cat and Story Genius and Anatomy of Story and all these other things that you need to read this? Probably not, but if you are coming to it new and you haven't read any of those things yet, and you want sort of like something that's going to help you get there, I think it could be helpful. It's just a lot of it was stuff we already kind of have gone over. But like I did have a huge breakthrough reading it. Yeah. So that's why I think overall there's no harm in reading craft books, even if a lot of it is repetitive, because sometimes it's different. Sometimes it just was the right moment, the right wording, the right example that just, really helped you. And that's why I wanted to focus on reading more this month, because I was really struggling with my revisions and I just needed to have to think about things differently from different. And I needed to hear some different people say some things to help me figure it out. And it worked, I think. So I think I'm going to be ready to go. But yeah, thank you guys for joining in the chat and talking with us. I will put out the video for next month's book. It's actually going to be up tomorrow. So stay tuned for that on my channel. And if you're not already subscribed to Liselle and Kevin, they are in the description. So be sure to check out their channels as well. And add
Lizelle's book on Goodreads.
Yeah,
I have a book on Goodreads.
Blood Like Magic, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to make sure.
I'm so excited for it.
Yeah.
Hopefully you don't hate it.
I love books about witches. So and I've read some terrible books about witches. Let me tell you. And I know you as a person. I can tell you're not going to write a bad book.
Yay!
You care too much to write a bad book.
All right. Well, thanks, guys, as always, for joining us and talking with us and all of the things. And we will see you next time. Hopefully we see you next month for the next chat. So, bye, guys.
Bye.